Thank you, Matthew. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. Good evening. I'm very pleased to be here. I believe that for the sixth time, either the fifth or sixth time, speaking here at Georgetown. And as Matthew indicated, I'm a proud father of a Georgetown graduate, my daughter Noor, my eldest daughter, who graduated last summer from Georgetown. I would like to acknowledge the International Relations Club and the Delta Pi Epsilon Professional Foreign Service Fraternity, and also a special thanks to Jeremy Bell and Jeff Naft for organizing this event. I'm sure there are so many different topics we could be talking about tonight, but I thought I would share with you most of the stuff that you wouldn't necessarily read or hear in the news as they cover the Middle East or everything that is going on there. And I'm sure there'll be some time in the Q&A portion to address those questions. I would like to focus this evening mostly on what I believe is the state of affairs in terms of the Iranian society and where it wants to go, as opposed to where the regime is and what it's trying to do. Part of the most, I would say, disturbing news is that, contrary to the perception that today you have more so-called moderate elements at the helm, and the opening towards the outside world seems to be a trend that everybody is excited about. The truth of the matter is that, according to numerous reports by various human rights organizations, including Ahmad Shahid, who is the UN rapporteur on human rights, the situation is getting even more dismal as we speak. There are more people in prison today, more people who have been executed under the current government than at the time of Ahmadinejad. We have serious problems when it comes to problems with drugs and prostitution. The whole drug trade is something that the regime is behind it by means of the IRGC elements that are controlling that entire process. And of course, they make money out of it, and they fund a lot of their activities as a result of that. The state of the economy is not good at all, despite the fact that there have been promises of trying to reform things, and with the sanctions lifted, see a difference, but most of the money will not end up in people's hand, as we suspect is probably going to continue financing the regime's war machine and its avant-gardes in the Middle East, whether it is Hezbollah or whether it is the Syrian regime and what have you. The good news, however, is that despite all the hardship, despite all the difficulties, despite all the pressure and all the arrests of lawyers and human rights activists or various individuals, Iranians have become far more resilient in terms of organizing themselves in civil disobedience by various means depending on their sector, and organizing themselves in the form of protests, demonstrations, and things of that nature. For instance, the latest activities that you could have perhaps followed in Iran was the teachers and the professors trying to organize themselves and talking about their problems. Same thing with nurses, same thing with students, and so on and so forth. What I'm trying to drive at is that if change is to occur in Iran, it has to occur by means of civil disobedience and nonviolence. I always believe that that's what I've been professing. And my position has been throughout all these years to encourage a change by means of the Iranian people themselves. In other words, not by means of foreign intervention or any change of that nature, but by finding a solution into how can one solve a problem that is win-win, both for the outside world looking in and for the Iranian people themselves. Because until now, everything that we've seen has been mostly lose-lose. There's been prospect of either cutting a bad deal with the regime, or there's been prospect of, if there's no deal, then we have to talk about military conflict. Whereas the most obvious answers that has been neglected for the past 36 years has been the Iranian people themselves. Let me put it this way. In all these years that I've been active, it will be, in fact, this weekend, my 55th birthday, so I've been doing this for the past 35 years. And in these 35 years, what I can tell you is that until now, if there has been any dialogue between foreign governments and Iran, it has been mostly limited to the regime and its representative. There has yet to be any official line of dialogue with any foreign government, particularly Western democratic government, with a secular democratic opposition, whether at home or abroad. And I find this a bit strange. If people are trying to get answers to how can we resolve the problem, why aren't you asking the question from the people who are the most relevant and have the most to say about in what way they could benefit? I'm sure some of you are aware that there are various broadcasting services that broadcast Farsi programming into Iran, such as, for instance, Voice of America or the BBC. Well, speaking of America as an example, over the years I've talked to many congressmen, senators, people in government, and I have yet to see a single member of the US government, for instance, to go to one of those studios, pick up a headphone, sit behind a microphone, and take a live random call from an individual from inside Iran and ask them what they think about the situation. I haven't seen that happen. And I find it very strange that when you're talking about a country and we're talking about 80 million people, the only thing that has been the instrument of telling you what the position is has been what the regime wanted you to know or what the regime wants you to hear. It is important, if you try to really understand the problematics of a region, let alone a country, to have a much better and more profound dialogue with the true representative of that country. History is full of examples where government had to deal with rogue regimes or totalitarian systems. There's nothing new to it. The Cold War was an era where we were faced with this constantly. And in fact, it was not until some of the dissidents managed to break through and gain access to the Western world, or better yet, the Western world had more exposure and had more access to them, that things began to change. The Soviet Union did not collapse just by itself. There was a phenomenon that took place. And yes, the more and more voices from the inside of Russia were heard internationally, and they were able to connect finally with the outside world. That started the whole process, which led to the Gorbachev era, which led to perestroika and glasnost, and ultimately the collapse of a totalitarian system, which, by the way, is something for us to consider. That history so far has proven to us that when totalitarian systems are forced to open up to the outside world, they become much more fragile and are more likely to collapse at the end of it. However, we're talking now about a region which is quite explosive. We're talking about a region that has been so much in turmoil that a lot of people fear the unknown. Whether you are a citizen of one of those countries, or you are a foreigner looking in, I bet you some people say, well, it could get worse than that. After what we experienced in Afghanistan or Iraq, or what is happening now in Syria, and this wave of refugees going all over the place, on top of it, add ISIS and all these other problems, what's going to happen to that region? And again, I think what is absent is that all you hear about on the headlines are the troublemakers, are those who in fact are the reason why the region are in turmoil. And yet one insists to only try to cut a deal with them or try to make them brokers of peace, where in fact they have been the instrument of this turmoil to begin with. One of the questions I would like all of us to ask, since we are in an election year in this country coming up, from all the people who are now running for the highest office of the land, is in terms of foreign policy, what is going to be the politics of the United States vis-a-vis the Middle East, or let's say, for instance, in particular, Iran? Is it going to be the same old stories that has been repeated from the days Ronald Reagan took over after the hostages were ultimately released from the US Embassy in Tehran? And whether it was a Republican or a Democrat in the White House, the basic strategy has been an expectation of behavior change by the regime. Are we going to ask the question a bit differently? Let me explain to you what I mean by that. I mentioned the Cold War. Well, during the Cold War, indeed, we had two diametrically opposed blocs. You had on the one hand a totalitarian system, the Soviet Union, with a sort of Marxist ideology and sort of international vision of some form. countered by the Western world, the US and its Western allies, with free market economy, human rights, what have you, democracy, liberty, and these two blocs were completely at odds. However, they were able to coexist simultaneously in the same sphere of rationality, to the point that even at the height of the Cold War, you did have military treaties between one another. SALT, MAD as an example. The problem you have with the regime that currently is installed in Iran is that it simply cannot coexist with the free world as we know it. The entire raison d'etre, the entire DNA is one that simply cannot accommodate itself with the values and the principles that is governed in what we consider the free world, democratic ideals, human rights, equality, and what have you. From their point of view, it's either you or them. For them to survive, they have to destroy what stands in their path. As such, it is impossible to come to terms or compromise or have a rational coexistence. This basic flaw in understanding the nature of this regime has led us over 3 decades now thinking that perhaps there would be some elements within the system that we can deal with in a better way than the other, as if the individual counts. It's not the individual, it's the system they represent. In that sense, it doesn't make any difference if you are named Khatami, Ahmadinejad, or Rouhani. You're there to preserve a system, and that system is at odds with a world that is looking at things differently. So if behavior cannot be changed, then it follows that every strategy that has been used so far, including economic sanctions, were, in my opinion, a waste of time in the sense that if the objective was to force a change of behavior as opposed to a change of regime, that did not happen. And the solution ultimately is a change of regime. Because so long as this regime is there, everything that you see right now is going to continue. Not just the nuclear agenda, mind you. Terrorism, radicalism, and the Iranian regime is the godfather of Islamic terrorism and radicalism. ISIS is simply a byproduct. And to think that ISIS and the Islamic Republic won't see more eye to eye with their common viewpoints against the West than having one pitted against the other as a potential ally is another, in my opinion, serious mistake that may be now contemplated by some people in the corridors of diplomacy. And as a final note, I wanted to spend more time in the Q&A, so I'm keeping it as concise as possible. I've heard throughout these years people talking about, is this a war of civilizations, or maybe it's a war of religions? I actually believe that it's none of the two. It's something else, however. It's a war between values. We are living a world where some people choose to believe in a way that counters the values that most of us believe. What are these values? Liberty, equality, non-discrimination of any form against an ethnicity, religious ideology, sexual orientation, male, female, what have you, as opposed to people who have a completely different set of values. And it doesn't matter if you're Middle Eastern or foreigner. There are some foreigners now, citizens from the UK, from France, from Canada, who go and join ISIS to fight the war against the values of a country that they once were brought up with. So it cannot be a question of religion, it cannot be a question of civilization, it's a question of values. And therefore, those of us who stand for the values that have proven to be what gives people their liberties, their rights, their dignity, their opportunities, that is the real war that we're in, against those who don't see this way. And frankly, they want to destroy us. And the only way to put an end to this is to destroy them. The question is how? Now, when I think of Iranians and my home country, I've always proposed a way that minimizes, at the most possible degree, loss of human life and cost in terms of change. But the bottom line is change has to occur if we want to put an end to all this problem. Now, we need to do our part as a society despite all the odds. But it goes without saying that such kind of changes, as we have witnessed it around the globe, when there has been movement for democratization and liberalization based on action of civil society and the people and the citizenry of those countries, it has not succeeded for the most part without tacit support from some key foreign countries and their citizenry. So I would like to simply end by saying this. When you look at this entire equation, when you look at the news and the topics that are being discussed, when you look at all the maneuverings that are going on, whether it is from Russia's point, whether it is the Syrian government, whether it is your own government here, don't forget one thing. At the end of the day, it's the people that will stand to benefit or suffer from the consequences of what is done. And I think it's time that the people of the region are brought to the forefront, that there's a better effort at trying to find ways to have a more direct dialogue with them, bypassing all those filters that keeps you from knowing really what is going on and what the people there really want. Because if that is going to be a breakthrough, you will see that what people are expecting and expect you to do in terms of your implementation of your policy is a far cry from what you are led on to believe by their so-called representatives as you meet them in various conferences or negotiation summits here and there. With this in mind, let me close here and open up for Q&As. Anything goes, so thank you very much for this opportunity.